The following program is a production of KSPS Public Television and is made possible by the Friends of Seven. Production of this program was made possible in part by a grant from Foundation Northwest, the community foundation helping good people do great things through philanthropy.
The history of America's West in Kansas. Yet in the inland Northwest, many remain unfamiliar with the roots of their heritage. Knowing the past is the first step to understanding the present and being part of the future. So join us as we retrace the path from whence we've come and discover the sovereign nations of the inland Northwest. All across North America, hundreds of native tribes have called the continent home for thousands of years. In modern times, tribes have been grouped geographically to denote cultural similarities and differences. The tribes of the inland Northwest are described as Plateau Indians. The boundaries of the Plateau region fall roughly along the Rocky Mountains on the east, the Cascade Mountain Range on the west, the upper reaches of the Fraser River to the north, and a line about midway through today's Oregon and Idaho in the south. Before settlers came, there were already thousands of people from a multitude of tribes who called this vast region home.
This river that comes down from the east here is the Nispelem River. It flows into the Columbia River right at this location here. And where this village is, there used to be probably about 30 different pit houses. The age of these pit houses are probably run from about 4,000 to 5,000 years back. Our people were, used the river for almost everything in their lives.
In what is now described as America's inland Northwest, some 19 tribes are still represented on 8 reservations. Historically, they are often overshadowed by the Plains and coastal Indians, but the tribes of the inland Northwest have always had their own unique cultures. The people here lived as hunters, gatherers, and traders. Their lifestyles were influenced by those neighbors they met and traded with, but that influence went both ways. Goods like these, which are indicative to this area, have been found far and wide among tribes of other regions. In particular, tribal members here were renowned for their basket weaving skills. Here in the inland Northwest, the lives of natives were tied directly to the heartbeat of the land and the rivers that carried its lifeblood.
Our earth we call Tumhula. Tum is mother. And when you put hula with it, it's our Mother Earth. And our Mother Earth is what really provides us with everything we have.
The tribes were generally divided into small bands, ranging over vast areas. But at certain times of year, they came together on common ground for a shared purpose.
For the summertime, the younger people generally went out and picked berries, and they hunted. They gathered different types of foods, camas and bitter roots and stuff like that.
But in late summer, the salmon always called them back to the rivers. One of the 2 largest gathering spots was at present-day Kettle Falls.
All the tribes would go and share in the fisheries at Kettle Falls. That fish would be divided equally among the size of the families and things like this by a salmon chief. They would issue out a certain portion to everybody that went there, and they could either dry their salmon there and take care of them there, or they could take them on home and take care of them when they got home.
The other large gathering spot for the salmon runs was located at what we now call Spokane Falls.
Right where we're standing actually is an old campground for the Indians of the area. The Spokanes were considered the owners as much as any Indian was considered an owner of a place, because this spot was a primary fishing spot.
Though most never saw the ocean from where the salmon came, the lives of inland Northwest tribal members were directly linked to salmon.
There were other things that we added to our food supply through the year, but the salmon was the primary food supply for the people. That meant that everything that the Indians did was geared towards that salmon harvest. That includes the social life, the social structures, the social mores, just everyday practices, and primarily the religious practices, which were an essential part of everyday life in those days before the runs were depleted. And so everything that they did was connected to that.
To supplement the salmon, many tribes made an annual trek across the mountains of Idaho into Montana to hunt for buffalo. Much could be gained, but there was risk as well. It was dangerous for people like the Coeur d'Alenes to leave their home range. The tribes of this region were generally peaceful and often tied by intertribal marriages. But relationships with tribes from outside their immediate areas were not always as friendly. When they crossed the mountains, skirmishes with tribes like the Blackfeet were common, and defending oneself in battle was celebrated. Fur traders were the first Europeans to venture into the inland Northwest and were welcomed by most tribes. Being traders, the natives were eager to develop relationships many felt would be beneficial to both sides. The Spokanes called the white men Suiapi.
Oh, what they're actually saying is bearded ones, because Indians didn't have beards. So what it means is hair on the face. And there's one story we have of a grandma and her granddaughters out picking, and the first contact was whites. They were picking berries, and all of a sudden they heard this crash boom coming through the brush, you know. They knew if it was an Indian, it'd be, you know, he wouldn't crack anything, you know, but here he just come lumbering through. And they all stopped and looked. First time they'd ever seen one white-skinned person, blue eyes. And they started screaming. Right there. And that guy took his cap off like that and wondering what was the matter with those guys and you know, why they were screaming. Then they really screamed. They says, upside down face. Because he had beard, had hair down here, and none up here. So Suiapi's part meaning is that it's upside down face.
The outside world became aware of the Columbia River in 1792, and from that point forward, traders and settlers began the hard push from the east to the west. It was 1807 when the first known white men entered the Spokane country. David Thompson, an employee of the Canadian-owned Northwest Company, led a party into the area to establish trading posts and trapping networks. He left Jacques Raphael Finley in the area to establish Spokane House. Located at the confluence of the Little Spokane and Spokane rivers, Spokane House soon became the hub of a far-flung trapping empire, embracing the entire Columbia Plateau. Today, nothing of the original fort remains. There are only these markers to indicate the outline of the first fur trading post in the interior of the Pacific Northwest. During its existence from 1808 to 1825, however, among other things, it boasted a ballroom and horse racing track. At the time, few realized this was the beginning of the end for an era that had lasted thousands of years. As trading posts introduced new products, traditional tribal life underwent dramatic changes. Wool blankets began to replace animal robes. Iron pots and pans were used instead of the coiled cooking baskets. And guns and ammunition made bows and arrows seem obsolete. Besides introducing new technology, the trappers were also the first to expose the tribes to white religion. In 1825, the proprietors of Spokane House sent 2 Indian boys to the Episcopalian mission at Red River in Manitoba. Spokane Gary and Pelly, the son of a Kootenai chief, were selected. For Gary, this experience set him on the path of leadership. By the time actual missionaries came to the Northwest, many tribes were so overwhelmed by the changing times they welcomed the Christian teachings.
A lot of tribes were looking in those very tumultuous times for a new spiritual power. In many ways, the white people coming in had so much control over reality. They had access to so much more technology than the Indian tribes had. So with access to technology and power, there's a spiritual dynamic involved in some way, and especially with medicines, because the old Indian healing ways were not adequate to handle measles and typhoid fever and whooping cough and scarlet fever and all those terrible epidemics that wiped out half the population in a lot of areas.
The first missionaries to come to the inland Northwest were Protestants. In 1838, Cushing Els and Elkanah Walker settled near present-day Tum Tum. At the mission they called Tishamakan, they exposed the Spokanes to European education, agriculture, and religion, but made no converts. They stayed 10 years, only to abandon the mission in 1848 during the aftermath of the notorious Whitman Massacre. The first missionary to visit the Coeur d'Alenes was a Catholic priest named Father de Smet. It is said his arrival had been anticipated for more than 100 years. Throughout much of the 16th century, the people now known as the Coeur d'Alene were led by a chief named Circling Raven. He is described as having prophetic powers, able to predict battles, as well as informing his people that the Savior of the world was born at a time we know as Christmas, and that this event should be celebrated every year. It is said that in the year of 1740, Circling Raven made another profound prophecy.
And they foretold the coming of the black robe. He had a vision. And so he told his tribe they're coming someday, And it did come.
He told his people that one day a man dressed in black robes would come to them. He said that he would be a friend to all mankind and would teach the truth, giving them powerful medicine to deal with sickness and changing times that lie ahead.
Because of this vision of an ancient medicine man by the name of Circling Raven, who had intuitive experiences, and he said that in these changing times of terrible plagues and epidemics and settlers, that something would come with new medicine power for the people, somebody with a black robe.
Year after year and season after season, Circling Raven searched and waited for the black robe. When he felt his time on earth was drawing to a close, he implored his son to remain vigilant. Twisted Earth did as his father instructed, searching not only his own territory, but that of the Flatheads in Montana for the black robe. It was the early summer days of 1842 that the Jesuit priest named Father de Smet finally came to the land of the Coeur d'Alenes in his flowing black robes. It is said that Twisted Earth proclaimed de Smet's arrival had fulfilled his father's 100-year-old prophecy. Many believe this is why many of the Coeur d'Alenes readily accepted and adopted the Catholic faith.
When they saw Father de Smet in 1842, there was this awesome thunderstruck meeting, and this is the fulfillment of Circling Raven's promise. And within a period of 10 years, this relatively small tribe, perhaps about 500 people at that time, all converted to Catholicism. And after a couple of years of a mission on the St. Joe River, they moved here to this place now called Cataldo in 1846. And the people themselves, with a couple of brothers that acted as architects, built this magnificent church that you see behind us today.
The mission church at Cataldo was completed in 1853. Many of the tribe's members lived in the area surrounding it until the intrusion of settlers forced them south, where they built another mission at present-day de Smet. In 1850, Congress passed the Donation Act, which opened so-called non-settled lands for settlement. Under the act, any citizen could claim up to 360 acres in the Oregon Territory, including lands occupied by Indians.
The people back east, they weren't making much money, and they figured there wasn't any knowledge of gold out here at that time, but the good land for farming and raising cattle and so on. And that, of course, completely disrupted the lives of the Indians, because they cut down the trees and killed the animals, and so it was, took over their land. And so it wasn't long before the Indians took exception to that.
In order for Indians to claim land under the Act, they had to sever their tribal affiliation and become an American citizen. Many tribal members were thrown off land they had been settled on for years because they did not understand or agree to the law.
They were told, but they didn't want to leave. Why should they leave their home? You know, I've been living in my home since 1973, when it was built. And if you came and told me, hey, get out of here, you know, we want this land and we want this house, you know. Well, would I? I mean, that's the same situation, that they were told to leave. And they'd been here for hundreds and hundreds of years. That river was their livelihood. And with the coming of the missionaries and whoever, you know, they were being taught how to farm, and they had their little gardens.
The Donation Act contributed greatly to the trouble which was to follow. The area we know as Washington became a territory of the United States of America on March 2, 1853. Isaac Stevens was appointed the first territorial governor and was designated a treaty commissioner, authorized to enter into treaties with the tribes in this territory.
People who were sent out here, like Governor Stevens, to be here in Washington, were totally dedicated to the development of that land and to civilizing, so-called, the Indians. And the Indians didn't necessarily want to be civilized. They certainly didn't want to lose their land.
In 1854 and 55, he signed treaties with the Yakimas and others of the central region. His commission then visited the Spokanes, but no treaty was reached. Stevens promised to return the following spring, but growing unrest in other areas of the territory forced his attention to be turned elsewhere.
There was a lot of unrest in central Washington. Partly the settlers kept crowding in. And then the gold was discovered in California, and then in Colville area and up in Canada. And so the people on the way to those mines passed through central Washington. And there were a number of times when these people were raided or tried to be chased out, and the whites demanded something be done about the so-called murders of the people who were passing through or who were settling on their land.
With no treaties and more settlers arriving with the misconception that they were entering unoccupied territory, tensions grew. By 1857, news from outside the area made matters worse.
Mr. Bolin, who was an Indian agent out here, was murdered by the Yakima Indians. So Major Haller was sent up here to discipline them, and he moved up into from Fort Dalles up into the Yakima area, and the Indians beat the hell out of him, and he lost quite a few men and quite a few officers. Lost a couple of cannons he had with him, howitzers, and a lot of equipment, and they were lucky to escape with their lives. So that was a burr under the saddle of the Army people. That was the representative figure of the government and the strength of our country was the Army. And when a bunch of so-called uncivilized natives could beat them, it was a pretty disgraceful situation.
Though signed, the treaties of 1854 and 55 were not ratified. So in 1857, several Northwest tribes, led by the Yakima Kamiakin, banded together in a desperate attempt to drive the whites out of their country. Kamiakin's father was a Palouse, a tribe that called the rolling hills of southeast Washington home. The Palouse had strong ties with the Yakimas and were often involved in raids and skirmishes south of the Snake River. So when the Yakima's assaults lost ground to the Army, Kamiakin withdrew from the Yakima Valley to take refuge with his father's people. Yet even here, trouble would soon follow. The area's closest Army outpost was Fort Walla Walla, where a young lieutenant colonel from Virginia who had gained fighting experience in the Mexican War was newly in charge. His name was E.J. Steptoe.
Sir, there appears to be so much excitement amongst the Palouse and Spokane Indians as to make an expedition to the north advisable, if not necessary. Some 40 persons living at Colville recently petitioned for the presence of troops at that place as they believe their lives and property to be in danger from hostile Indians. 2 white men are reported to have been killed recently near Palouse River on their way to Colville. An Indian gave me today the names of the Palouse Indians said to be implicated. I will investigate the matter thoroughly during my trip.
Except for the Palouse in eastern Washington, the Indians in this area were peaceful, and the Coeur d'Alenes and the Spokanes and the various other tribes that Nez Perce had boasted that they'd never shed white blood. And so he didn't think it was much danger in going up there to that area. And some of the priests warned him that they'd never had trouble with the Indians in this area, but that the Indians said if the military moved in there, that they would resist them.
Already concerned by the number of whites coming into the area, the tribes became truly alarmed by indications that the Army was having a lieutenant by the name of Mullen build roads into their country.
Father Josette told Steptoe that the Coeur d'Alenes had often been told that the government planned to seize their lands. As evidence of this, they had seen survey parties at work in their country, and mischief makers had taunted them. See, they are getting ready to take your lands. The northern tribes agreed that this was proof enough of civilization's intentions, and that they had to fight against it. The Yakimas already had much trouble over this issue, and now the 3 tribes could have massacred any group marching into the land by force. Chief Joseph Celtice of the Coeur d'Alenes.
But Steptoe still felt these people were friendly, and that he was going. It was just on a fact-finding expedition and a way of training some of his new troops, new recruits. So they didn't have the arms that they should have had. They didn't have enough ammunition with them, and they didn't expect to fight.
Steptoe left Fort Walla Walla on May 6th of 1858 with 5 company officers, 152 enlisted men, 85 pack animals, and 2 howitzer cannons. Shortly before his departure, reports say a band of Palouse had raided the valley and taken several Army cattle.
Hearing that the hostile Palouses were near Alpononui in the Nez Perce land, I moved to that point and was ferried across the Snake River by Timothy, a Nez Perce chief. The enemy fled toward the north, and I followed leisurely on the road to Colville.
Chief Joseph Celtice of the Coeur d'Alene laid out the history told to him by his elders in a book called The Saga of the Coeur d'Alene. As is often the case, the stories passed on by Native Americans to their children vary from the official government records.
He reported that Palouse Indians were raiding the Walla Walla Valley and driving off horses, cattle, and some 13 head of beef that belonged to the Army. After Steptoe left Walla Walla, his first desire was to corner the Palouses at the Snake River. They were a small band of 150, including men, women, and children, and Steptoe had already arranged with Nez Perce Timothy so that he would not allow them to cross the river at the crossing controlled on the Snake. So the Palouse were forced to cross the foaming Snake River in makeshift rafts, 12 miles above the Timothy crossing. It was a sorrowful occurrence because a young Palouse woman drawn with her 2 babies, while Steptoe's troops laughed and shot at the Indians fleeing across the river.
In letters and journals of the soldiers, there is no mention of this encounter. In fact, they speak of nothing eventful happening until the 11th day on the trail, when the soldiers reached the area of North Pine Creek and Rock Lake.
Sunday morning, the 16th, when near Tohotonomy in the Spokane country, we found ourselves suddenly in the presence of 10 or 1,200 Indians of various tribes, Spokanes, Palouses, Coeur d'Alenes, Yakimas, and some others, all armed, painted, and defiant. I moved slowly on until just about to enter a ravine that wound along the bases of several hills, which were all crowned by the excited savages. Perceiving that it was their purpose to attack us in this dangerous place, I turned aside and encamped. the whole wild, frenzied mass moving parallel to us, and by yells, taunts, and menaces, apparently trying to drive us to some initiatory act of violence.
The colonel went up over a rolling hill and reached Rock Lake. The Indians got above us on the creek and made a camp. Then towards night, a number of the chiefs came down to our camp to talk to Colonel Steptoe and inquire what his motives were for this intrusion upon them. Michael Kinney, Sergeant, G Troop, 1st Dragoons.
I answered that we were passing on to Colville and had no hostile intentions toward the Spokanes, who had always been our friends, nor towards any other tribes that were friendly. That my chief aim in coming so far was to see the Indians and the white people at Colville, and by friendly discussion with both, endeavor to strengthen their good feelings for each other.
History says that Steptoe didn't plan on an encounter when he left Walla Walla, and that his expedition was not equipped for a campaign. But hadn't Colonel Wright been preparing for such expeditions during the past 2 years? Were not all those men carrying rifles, the fully loaded pack train, and the large guns a preparation for battle? It certainly wasn't a peace parade. Chief Joseph Seltese of the Coeur d'Alenes.
Nevertheless, Steptoe recounts that those present seemed satisfied with his explanation. However, the chiefs all refused to grant him use of canoes, without which he could not cross the Spokane River and proceed to Colville. Early the next morning, Steptoe's command turned back toward Fort Walla Walla. Before noon, Colonel Steptoe was visited by Father Josette, a missionary with the Coeur d'Alenes, and Vincent, one of that tribe's chiefs. Accounts from both sides say that Steptoe and Vincent agreed there would be no fighting.
Unfortunately, there was among the Yakimas a certain Qualchin, nephew of the Yakima, Chief Kamiakin. He was already having a meeting with 5 Palouse Indians to discuss treachery. Then Qualchin of the Yakimas ran his horse down to the moving column and fired twice into the column at close range. Then the bugle sounded, and the troops quickly turned and fired at the Indians. That morning of May 17, 1858, the Battle of Steptoe was on.
We had not marched 3 miles when the Indians, who had gathered on the hills adjoining the line of march, began an attack on the rear guard, and immediately the fight became general. We labored under the great disadvantage of having to defend the pack train while in motion and in a rolling country peculiarly favored to the Indian mode of warfare. We had only a small quantity of ammunition, but in their excitement, the soldiers could not be restrained from firing it in the wildest manner. E.J. Steptoe, May 23rd, 1858.
The Coeur d'Alenes did well to put 200 warriors into this battle, since there had never been over 500 Coeur d'Alenes, men, women, and children, for the past 500 years. There were also 175 Yakimas, 150 Spokanes, and 5 Palouses. A total of 530 Indians were fighting, and not the 1,200 that history talks about.
By either side's account, the Indians had the army outnumbered and on the run. After a mobile battle wherein Steptoe lost 2 of his officers, he disposed his troops on the closest high ground, and they dug in.
The dead and the wounded were brought into this barricade. The Indians circling us in close quarters, yelling their war whoops.
Here, the battle continued unabated, with the soldiers pinned down and running low on ammunition, while the warriors constantly tested the perimeter.
Twice, the enemy gave unmistakable evidence of a design to carry our position by assault, and their number and desperate courage caused me to fear the most serious consequences to us from such an attempt on their part.
As the sun set, the Indians broke off their main attack, leaving Steptoe's men with scant rounds of ammunition left and no hope of rest or reinforcements. Given their desperate situation, the command determined they must use the shadows of darkness and stealth to slip through the Indian lines and make a forced march back to the Snake River.
I concluded to abandon everything that might impede our march. Accordingly, we set about 10 o'clock in perfectly good order, leaving disabled animals and such as were not in condition to travel so far and so fast. And, with deep pain, I have to add, the howitzers. The necessity of this last measure will give you, as well as many words, a conception of the strait to which we believed ourselves to be reduced. Not an officer of the command doubted that we would be overwhelmed with the first rush of the enemy upon our position in the morning.
Though there is no mention of it in the official reports, Chief Joseph Seltese of the Coeur d'Alene wrote that his ancestors played a significant role in the Army's escape.
They all realized that annihilation awaited Steptoe's column the following morning, and they shared a feeling of humanity for the remaining troops. Finally, they decided they would make an opening on both sides of the creek they were guarding, and that Seltese and Sebastian would carry a note to Steptoe's remnant entrenched on the hill. Steptoe read the note, which was signed by Father Joseph Josette in the name of Vincent, Seltese, and Wildshrew. At 10 p.m., the remaining column marched down the hill and followed the creek bed. To their astonishment, the troops found the Coeur d'Alene Indians all kneeling on one knee, with the butt of their rifles on the ground and the end of the barrel up in the air. Steptoe's remnant passed through the Coeur d'Alene lines and then made a dash for the Snake River to avoid any hostile pursuit.
News of Steptoe's defeat spread quickly. This was the second time the Army had lost a conflict in the Northwest to native tribes, and it would not go unanswered. General Newman S. Clark, the commander of the Department of the Pacific, lost no time in sending all the available troops in California north to Washington Territory. Father Josette went to General Clark to tell the Indian side and sue for peace. According to the father, Vincent, the chief who shook hands with Steptoe before the battle, had this to say.
I had no intention to fight, but at seeing the corpse of my brother-in-law, I lost my head. What would be the consequences? If we are pardoned, we will faithfully restore all that has been taken. If not, we will remain home, and if we are attacked, we will defend ourselves to the last. Vincent of the Coeur d'Alenes, 1858.
In reply, Clark told the priests to relay the following message. He stated that the Army did not need permission to enter the country in question, but if the tribes desired peace, they must do the following. Drive Kamiakin and all other hostiles of other tribes from their land, return the property taken from Steptoe's troops, and surrender the men who first fired on the troops in disobedience to their chiefs. The priests quickly learned that the tribes would not abide by these terms. The replies of various chiefs were written down and sent back.
The practice of Indians is different from what you think. They want to make peace. They want to cease hostilities. They bury the dead and live again on good terms. They don't speak of more blood. I speak the truth. I, Indian, don't want to fight you. You're at liberty to kill me, but I will not deliver my neighbors. If it should be my practice, I would act according and deliver them. That's a practice of your own. Palakin, Spokane Tribe, 1858.
I feel unwilling to give you up, my three brothers. For I think though we fought, I won't begin to make peace. I want you to begin if you want to make peace. You come into my country, Milkapsi of the Coeur d'Alene.
He asked for some to be delivered up. The poor Indians can't take that. But if you withdraw this one word, you will surely make peace. Gary of the Spokane Tribe.
The Army's plans for retaliation were not delayed by the Father's peace mission. General Clark and Governor Stevens wanted the Indians responsible for the attack on Steptoe to be punished, so 2 expeditions were prepared. The main force was placed under the command of a colonel by the name of George H. Wright of the 9th Infantry. He came from his post at the Dalles to Fort Walla Walla and began making preparations. The second expedition was based out of Fort Simcoe under the command of Major Robert S. Garnett. This force numbered 300 and set out August 10th, traveling northeast through the Yakima country towards Colville. Its mission was to drive any hostiles back across the Columbia and into the path of Wright's advancing force. On August 7th, Captain E.D. Keyes had left Fort Walla Walla with a group of troops to build a fortification where the Tucannon River empties into the Snake. They called it Fort Taylor, and the campaign would really begin here when they crossed the Snake River.
Numerous reports and stories had reached us that the Indians were exulting in their victory over Steptoe, and they were confident that not a man of us who crossed the Snake River would return alive. Captain E.D. Keyes, 1858.
Before Colonel Wright left Walla Walla, he concluded a treaty with the Nez Perces signed by Chiefs Timothy, Richard, Three Feathers, and Speaking Eagle. 30 warriors volunteered to join Wright's campaign, and after being outfitted with Army uniforms, they were placed under the command of Lieutenant John Mullen, whose job of road building had been interrupted by the fighting. Wright arrived at Fort Taylor on the 18th, and after final preparations, the entourage crossed the Snake.
On the 25th and 26th, I made passage with my entire command without loss or accident, and encamped on the right bank of the river with 570 regulars, 30 friendly Nez Perce, 100 employees, and 800 animals of all kinds, with subsistence for 38 days. Colonel George Wright, August 31st, 1858.
They marched north for 3 days without much incident, but this time there was no illusion that the mission would be peaceful.
On the 30th of August, they first showed themselves in small scouting parties, and the next day they appeared in considerable numbers, skirting our line of march for several hours, but keeping out of gunshot. They were apparently luring us to a favorable spot they had previously selected to attack and destroy us.
Their march continued on the 31st, and throughout the day, the Indians skirted the column. Then late in the afternoon, the warriors set fire to the prairie grass and used the smoke to cover an attack on the pack train. A skirmish erupted, but was put down by the rear guard, led by Captain Keyes.
Within 5 minutes from the first command, the whole train and everything else was enclosed in a rectangle of armed men, and the attack repulsed. The promptness of the maneuver was admirable and showed the benefit of discipline and previous instruction.
That evening, the troops camped in what is now known as the Four Lakes area outside of Cheney. It was Wright's intention to rest his men and animals here for a day or so before continuing towards the Spokane River and the impending fight. However, the very next day, he was forced to change his plans.
Early in the morning of the 1st, I observed the Indians collecting on the summit of a high hill, about 2 miles distant, and immediately ordered the troops under arms.
After careful preparation, Wright sent the dragoons, a company of foot soldiers, and Mullen's scouts ahead to dislodge the warriors from the hill.
On reaching the crest of the hill, I saw at once the Indians were determined to measure their strength with us, showing no disposition to avoid a combat and firmly maintaining their position at the base of the hill, keeping up a constant fire upon the 2 squadrons of dragoons who were awaiting the arrival of the foot troops.
Though they thought themselves better trained, better armed, and generally superior, the sight awaiting Wright's troops made a vivid impression. Lieutenant Lawrence Kipp wrote,
"My place as adjutant of the artillery battalion was of course with Captain Keyes. We rode to the top of the hill when the whole scene lay before us like a splendid panorama. On the plain below us we saw the enemy. Every spot seemed alive with the wild warriors we had come so far to meet. They were in the pines on the edges of the lakes, in the ravines and gullies, on the opposite hillsides, and swarming over the plain. They seemed to cover the country for some 2 miles. Mounted on their fleet, hardy horses, the crowd swayed back and forth, brandishing their weapons, shouting their war cries, and keeping up a song of defiance. Most of them were armed with Hudson Bay muskets, while others had bows and arrows and long lances. They were in all the bravery of their war array, gaudily painted and decorated with their wild trappings. Their plumes fluttered above them, while below skins and trinkets and all kinds of fantastic embellishments flaunted in the sunshine."
According to Chief Joseph Celtice, The main force of the Indians was made up of 100 Coeur d'Alene, 150 Spokanes, 172 Yakima, and 45 Palouse. Yet despite their impressive display, the warriors' efforts were doomed. This time, the soldiers had long-range rifles, with which the warriors' muskets could not compete. The Battle of 4 Lakes was over within 4 hours of the Army's departure from camp.
As we rode back, we saw on the plain evidences of the fight. In all directions were scattered the arms, muskets, quivers, bows and arrows, blankets, robes, etc., which had been thrown away by our flying enemies. Horses, too, were roaming about, which our Indian allies were employed in catching. It was amusing to see the troops returning with their trophies. One officer had 2 buffalo robes and a blanket wrapped around himself and horse. What the Indian loss was, we cannot exactly say, as they carry off their dead. Some 17, however, were seen to be killed, while there must have been between 40 and 50 wounded. Strange to say, not one of our men was injured. One dragoon horse alone was wounded. This was owing to the long-range rifles now first used by our troops, and the discipline which enabled them so admirably to use them. Had the men been armed with those formerly used, the result of the fight as to the loss on our side would have been far different. For the enemy outnumbered us and had all the courage which we are accustomed to ascribe to Indian warriors.
2 dragoons were killed during their attack, and it was not by eating poisonous roots, as some writers had claimed. Only 2 Indians were killed, a Spokane and a Yakima. During battle, the Indians usually jumped off their horses to get a good sight and fire. Then it was easy to jump back on their horses and be off at a dead run. Because they dismounted to fire, some writers might call them shot or dead when they merely jumped off their horses. They could not fight on even terms with a foe twice their number and armed with rifles, having twice the range of their own. This was the lesson they learned at the Battle of 4 Lakes.
For 3 days after the battle, the troops remained in their camp at 4 Lakes to rest themselves and their stock.
This gave the Indians more time, and they planned to give the troops a battle on the plain, and then trick them into following a retreat through the narrow canyon some 6 miles southeast of Little Falls. They made careful plans to draw the troops into a narrow canyon some 8 miles northwest of Riordan, where they would bring about another disaster.
As both sides prepared to meet again, the weather began to change. By the time the troops had resumed their march on September 5th, it had grown cold and damp.
At first we saw no Indians, but at the end of an hour they began to show themselves, and to move along parallel with our line of march over the rough ground, beyond which was the great Spokane Plain.
We had nearly reached the woods when they advanced in great force and set fire to the dry grass of the prairie, so that the wind blowing high and against us, we were nearly enveloped by the flames.
Our situation was sufficiently alarming when we discovered, a few hundred yards to the front and left, a patch of bare rock and scant herbage. Upon that, we collected our animals in haste, and the drivers put out the fire on the short stubble, which gave room and saved us from the stampede. Meanwhile, the enemy had opened fire upon us, and our men passed through where the flames were least, Greer and his dragoons leading, and commenced the Battle of the Spokane Plains.
The Indians charged and retreated frequently. At the edge of the woods near Deep Creek, a large number gathered to try to induce the troops towards Riordan, where their trap had been planned. But the troops were already tired out, and Wright could not be coaxed towards the trap.
The battle took place over 14 miles of prairie, hills, ravines, woods, and rocks. Overlapping skirmishes were constantly underway as both sides fought bravely on. After 7 hours, the fighting finally came to an end as the troops approached the Spokane River.
We have again had a proof of the efficiency of the new rifles and the thorough discipline of the command, as but one man was slightly wounded. Some 500 Indians are supposed to have been engaged in the fight. How many were killed and wounded we cannot tell, from their custom which I have mentioned before of carrying off their dead at once. They were removed generally before the troops could cross the ravines to get at them. We learned afterwards that Kamiakin, the great war chief of the Yakimas, was almost killed. A shell burst in a tree near him, tearing off a branch which struck him on the head, inflicting a wound. The Indians apparently retreated but a few miles, as after dark we saw their campfires in the distance, and also a great light, which proved to be one of their villages they were burning.
After the Battle of the Spokane Plains, the Army made camp near the site where Fort George Wright would later be built, and they rested there for 3 days.
The Indians were also tired and could not press the troops any further, since they were so greatly outnumbered by superior weapons and had not been able to lure Wright into their trap. Chief Gary of the Spokanes was now ready to surrender, but Kamiakin of the Yakimas said he would never give in to Wright or to anyone.
On the 7th, the troops advanced along the north bank of the Spokane. As they did, Indians appeared on the opposite side, saying that Chief Gary wished to speak with the colonel. They met at a ford 2 miles above Spokane Falls.
I halted at the ford and encamped. Soon after, Gary crossed over and came to me. He said that he had always been opposed to fighting, but the young men and many of the chiefs were against him, and he could not control them. I then told him to go back and say to all the Indians and the chiefs, "I have met you in 2 bloody battles. You have been badly whipped. You have lost several chiefs and many warriors killed or wounded. I have not lost a man or animal. I have a large force. And you Spokanes, Coeur d'Alenes, Palouses, and Pend d'Oreilles may unite, and I can defeat you as badly as before. I did not come into this country to ask you to make peace. I came here to fight. Now, when you are tired of the war and ask for peace, I will tell you what you must do. You must come to me with your arms, with your women and children, and everything you have, and lay them at my feet. You must put your faith in me and trust to my mercy. If you do this, I shall then dictate the terms upon which I will grant you peace. If you do not do this, war will be made on you this year and next, and until your nation shall be exterminated."
After Wright finished speaking with Gary, Chief Pilatkin approached with 9 warriors. Wright said Pilatkin was conspicuous in the attack on Colonel Steptoe and was a leader in the battles against him as well. Among the 9 warriors was one they believed to be responsible for the killing of the Colville miners. Therefore, Wright imprisoned those 2, telling the others to go bring back the rest of their people. At sunrise on the 8th, the troops were on the move again. As they traveled along the south bank of the Spokane River, over an extensive grassy plain, they saw a great cloud of dust rising in the distance.
They got out to almost the state line, where there was a bridge at one time, and they saw a group of Indians driving this big herd of horses. They first saw the cloud of dust. They saw the horses being driven into the mountains, and the cavalry chased after and brought them back.
Some 900 horses were captured. Then later in the day, lodges and granaries were burned. At the camp that night, Wright then turned his attention to his prisoners.
I investigated the case of the Indian prisoner suspected of having been engaged in the murder of the 2 miners. The fact of his guilt was established beyond doubt, and he was hung at sunset.
On September 9th, the main force of the Army remained camped along the Spokane River, while the dragoons were sent out to destroy any Indian lodges and food stores they encountered. For those in camp, there was other business to attend to.
At 9 o'clock, Colonel Wright convened a board of officers to determine what should be done with the captured horses. They decided that 130 should be selected for our use and the rest shot. It was a disagreeable necessity, but one which could not be avoided. most of them being wild, they could not be taken with us on our march and must be prevented from falling again into the hands of their former owners. Nothing can more effectually cripple the Indians than to deprive them of their animals.
An enclosure was made, the animals driven in, then one by one, lassoed, dragged out, and dispatched with a single shot. By the end of the first day, 270 were killed. After that, the companies were ordered to fire volleys into the corral in order to speed up the process.
I deeply regretted killing these poor creatures, but dire necessity drove me to it. This work of slaughter has been going on since 10 o'clock of yesterday and will not be completed before this evening. I shall march for the Coeur d'Alene mission tomorrow. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, George Wright.
In 2 days, the number shot by actual tally was 690, and the expenditure of cartridges about twice as many. It was a cruel sight to see so many noble beasts shot down. They were all sleek, glossy, and fat, and as I love a horse, I fancied I saw in their beautiful faces an appeal for mercy. Towards the last, the soldiers appeared to exult in their bloody task, and such is the ferocious character of men.
While making its way to the Coeur d'Alene mission, Wright's army traveled the length of the Spokane Valley, burning and destroying every lodge and food store they came upon. They were traveling to the mission because on the morning of the 10th, a letter from Father Josette had been delivered to the colonel. It proclaimed that the Indians desired peace. And even though they greatly underestimated the lake's size, Wright's men were deeply impressed as they traveled near present-day Coeur d'Alene.
This is splendid country as a home for the Indians, and we cannot wonder that they are aroused when they think the white men are intruding on them. The Coeur d'Alene Lake, one of the most beautiful I have ever seen, with water clear as crystal, is about 15 miles in length, buried as it were in the Coeur d'Alene Mountains, which rise around on every side. The woods are full of berries, while in the Spokane River, salmon abound below the falls and trout above. In the winter season, deer and elk are found in the mountains. Many parts of the country are good for grazing, while there are a sufficient number of fertile spots where crops can easily be raised. When the Indian thinks of the hunting grounds to which he is looking forward in the spirit land, we doubt whether he could imagine anything more in accordance with his taste than this reality.
Wright reached the Coeur d'Alene mission without further incident and found that many of the Coeur d'Alenes were anxiously awaiting an outcome.
The chastisement which these Indians have received has been severe, but well merited and absolutely necessary to impress them with our power. For the last 80 miles, our route has been marked by slaughter and devastation. 900 horses and a large number of cattle have been killed or appropriated to our own use. Many houses with large quantities of wheat and oats, also many caches of vegetables, camas, and dried berries have been destroyed. A blow has been struck, which they shall never forget.
On September 17th, Wright held council with the Coeur d'Alenes at their mission, where he dictated the Treaty of Peace. The terms were, surrender those who commenced the attack on Steptoe, deliver any property taken during that or any other encounter, allow whites to travel unmolested through their country, declare peace with the Nez Perce who had fought with the army against them, and deliver one chief and 4 men with their families to be held as hostages at Fort Walla Walla for 1 year to ensure that they honor the treaty. After settling with the Coeur d'Alenes, Wright's army made its way here to Latah Creek, where a similar treaty was signed with the Spokanes.
September 23rd. We did not move camp this morning, as it was the day appointed for the council, which after breakfast assembled in front of Colonel Wright's tent. The Indians numbered 107. Besides the Spokanes were Ponderay, Colvilles, and delegates from other small tribes. Lieutenant Lawrence Kipp, 1858.
The chiefs Geary, Palatkin, and McCapsey were present. The first two are Spokanes, and the last is a Coeur d'Alene. It will be recollected that each of those men wrote a letter to the general in August last. The entire Spokane nation, chiefs, headmen, and warriors, expressed great joy that peace was restored and promised before the Great Spirit to remain our true friends forevermore. They have suffered, they have felt us in battle, and I have faith that they will keep their word. Colonel George Wright, September 24th, 1858.
Wright's mission was not just to defeat the tribes. He had also been told to avenge the murder of the two miners Steptoe had been sent out to investigate. As a result, throughout the campaign, he ordered the hanging of some 15 Indians. The largest group was hung while the troops camped along Latah Creek, which has since also been known as Hangman Creek. It was here that Kamaikan's nephew Qualchan, the Yakima Minisay, started the battle with Steptoe, finally came face to face with Wright.
Qualchan came in with his wife and with his brother and into the camp the next morning. He thought he'd be treated like everybody else, and that he was hanged on the spot. He to them was a real criminal, responsible for a lot of white deaths.
The day after Qualchan was hung, a number of Palouse came into the camp. 15 of them were seized, 6 were hung, and the rest were placed in irons. The campaign came to its official close after the troops returned to Walla Walla in the fall of 1858. Today, many believe Wright's actions were brutal and unconscionable. But at the time, he was criticized by people like General Clark as being too lenient.
The politicians didn't think he'd done enough, and I think that the average citizen at that time felt that they were a lot safer than they were before he'd been on his campaign.
How Wright should be judged still remains a point of controversy.
Oh, I think that he probably he's given his orders and he was a good soldier, you know, all that, but I believe that there has to be hatred in the heart to do everything that he's done to us, you know, to my ancestors, and to I could no more go outside of town here and burn a house down and slaughter their cattle and horses. I couldn't do that.
Justified or not, Wright's campaign set the course this area's history would follow. Though disagreements remain common, the sovereign nations of the Northwest have never since taken up arms against each other.